making one bad decision after another, and it led her down a path that quickly became too treacherous to come back from. All throughout this time, despite Laura's claims that she didn't want to be involved with Dylan, and despite his claims that he didn't want to be involved with her either, Laura and Dylan remained in almost constant contact. In fact, in the days leading up to her disappearance, Laura and Dylan spoke on the phone at least 100 times. I wasn't able to confirm if this communication was via calls or texts, but either way, they were still on speaking terms and they were making the most of it. The two had made plans to meet up on the evening of July 3rd, and later that night, Laura headed toward Kipling subway station in Toronto, where Dylan picked her up, driving her to his home. An hour later, Laura's phone turned off and would never come back on again. Now, fair warning, the case takes a rapid nosedive from here, and the events all take place rather quickly, one right after the other. So buckle down and maybe even take some notes, because things are about to get crazy in very rapid succession. After Laura met up with Dylan that evening, Dylan sent out a text message at around 7:30 p.m. to his friend Mark Smitch. The message read, "I'm on a mission, back in 1 hour." No further texts were sent after this. The very next day, Sean Lerner received a notification that the iPad that he'd given Laura had suddenly been renamed Mark's iPad. Safe to assume that Dylan's aforementioned friend, Mark, had come into possession of Laura's iPad. But how? Immediately after this, Dylan took a photo on his cell phone, showing an object wrapped in a blue tarp, located on his farm in Waterloo. And it's been suggested that this photo was shared with Mark. Later that same day, Dylan accepted a same-day delivery for a brand new mattress. I think we can all tell what's probably going on here. Laura spends the night, then all of a sudden Dylan's taking photos of something wrapped in a tarp, then buying a new mattress. Things were getting fishy, to say the least. But if this wasn't clear enough, things are about to get worse. In the days leading up to all this, Dylan had contacted his mechanic friend and asked him to make arrangements to deliver an animal incinerator to his farm. This incinerator arrived on July 5th, 2 days after Laura was last seen. This brings us to July 14th, 2012, the day that Laura's family decided to file a missing person report. See, Laura was known to lose touch with her parents from time to time. After all, they were still caught up in a bit of a disagreement at this point. But it was incredibly unusual for Laura to not make contact with her friends. It's been noted that she spoke to her friends literally every single day up to this point. But when the missing person report was filed, Sean Lerner says that police didn't seem concerned in Laura's case at all, especially after they learned about her mental health issues and her work as an escort. It was almost as if they completely shut down after learning this. 9 days passed by without any leads coming to or from the police who were working the case. But on the evening of July 23rd, Dylan sent a text message to Mark saying, "Barbecue has run its warm-up. It's ready for meat." Immediately after this text was sent, Dylan made a Google search, seeking the correct temperature for cremation. Soon after, Dylan took a photo of Mark standing next to the cooker. The objects that were seen inside the cooker at this point were later described by a forensic expert as resembling human bones. By late July, Laura's final phone bill was delivered to her parents' home. Desperate for answers, her parents opened the bill and looked at her call history. They immediately noticed that the final calls she made were to Dylan, someone she'd supposedly written off and moved on from. This was the biggest red flag her parents could have possibly found, and they immediately called all her other friends, desperate for more information about her secret relationship with Dylan. One of the people her parents reached out to was Sean Lerner. Sean took it upon himself to reach out to Dylan, asking if he had any information about Laura. He sent Dylan a text that read, quote, "I'm not looking to point a finger at anyone, but we're concerned about Laura, and it looks like you were the last person to correspond with her." Dylan initially ignored these texts, but the two later set up a time to meet at a local Starbucks to chat about the situation. When the date finally rolled around, the two spoke briefly before Dylan began making allegations that Laura was nothing but an addict who continued hounding him hoping for a fix. Dylan says he repeatedly denied Laura's requests and had no involvement in her disappearance. But then he made a pretty shocking statement. As the two ended their conversation, Dylan informed Sean that he should have, quote, "no reasonable expectation of finding her." This brings us to August of 2012, when the pieces finally began to fit together. Mark had invited a few of his friends over to his mother's home, and they were hanging out in the garage when Mark began rapping. I can't tell if he was rapping as a joke or if he was serious about it, but my gosh, is it awful.
Started off on skin and bone, now to lay on some ashy stone. Last time I saw us outside the home, and if you go swimming, you can find a bone. Find a bone? What? Find a bone. If you go swimming, you can find a bone. Find a bone. Find a bone. If you find a bone. If you go swimming, you can find a bone. Lay on some ashy stone.
In this weird rap, Mark says that she started off as skin and bone, and now she lays on ashy stone. And he ends the segment by claiming, if you go swimming, you can find your phone. I don't know about you, but this sounds like a confession if I've ever heard one. Mark's friends were apparently shocked by this as well, and that's why they eventually agreed to testify against Mark, saying that he would later confess to claiming a girl's life, burning the remains, and then disposing of the evidence in a lake. Mark was very clearly terrible at keeping secrets. This was all investigators needed to pin both Mark and Dylan for the disappearance of Laura Babcock. But this isn't the end of the case by any means. After detectives learned of Mark's ridiculous confession, they obviously pieced together the connection to Laura Babcock's case. But they also started to reinvestigate another crime that involved Dylan's own father, Wayne Millard. Wayne had lost his life a while back, but investigators initially ruled that he'd claimed his own life, resulting in Dylan becoming the heir to his father's multi-million-dollar estate. But now that they learned the extent of Dylan's involvement with Laura, they wanted to re-examine his father's case, planning to pin Dylan for that crime as well. If this weren't bad enough, investigators also learned of a third man who was involved with Dylan. This man had listed a pickup truck for sale on a local shopping app, and Dylan and Mark showed up to test drive it. While out driving the car, they claimed the life of the owner and presumably stole the truck. This victim was also disposed of in the duo's makeshift incinerator. Now, the story of Dylan and Mark goes much deeper than this, and pretty much everyone who knew the two were somehow involved in the case, with a female friend of the two even being accused of helping clean up the scene of the crime and destroying evidence. If you'd like to see a more in-depth look at the crimes of these two, just let me know in the comments and I may revisit this in the future. But for today's video, I want to stay focused on Laura Babcock. For the duo's crimes against Laura, they were each sentenced to 25 years behind bars. Even though Laura's remains have never been found, Dylan has since appealed the charges placed against him regarding the disappearance of Laura, but it seems safe to assume that these appeals will most likely be denied. Thankfully, Laura's family were finally able to get justice for the horror that their daughter was put through. But in the end, this doesn't bring Laura back. It doesn't really solve anything at all. We may never know why Dylan went to such drastic means to get Laura out of his life. There's truly no sense to it. It's heartwarming to know that this pathetic shell of a man was finally taken off the streets of Toronto. But it doesn't change the fact that the damage is already done. Allie Costiel was born in St. Louis, Missouri, but had always dreamed of attending the University of Mississippi. When she was finally given this chance, in her eyes, life couldn't have gotten much better. But then, things changed. Investigators say that there weren't any clues or evidence that could have tipped off Allie's friends before her life was tragically cut short on that July afternoon. Detectives who arrived at the scene of the crime couldn't understand how someone could have done such a thing to a well-behaved, easygoing student. But that's when they honed in on their primary suspect, another student who had a secret agenda that no one could have ever seen coming. Allie Costiel was 21 years old in 2019, attending Mississippi State University in Oxford, Mississippi.
All day haters can go suck a dick, bitch.
Oxford, Mississippi is a relatively small town. There isn't a whole lot going on there. I was there just a couple weeks ago, and best I could tell, it was a town that didn't have much to offer outside of a few restaurants and outdoor stores like Tractor Supply. With a population of about 25,000, it's a quaint little town, very quiet, and certainly a great place for college students to live, as there's only so much trouble you can get into in such a small, lazy town. The University of Mississippi is really the main draw for the town, and I think it's safe to assume that the college is likely where the town gets most of its money as well. The university has an acceptance rate of around 90%, but the reason most people go here is likely because its tuition is relatively low compared to other similar schools. And with the graduation rate of about 65%, it fits right in line with schools that may cost 10 times as much while offering what's essentially the same exact education. This is likely why Ali Costiel was so determined to attend the University of Mississippi. A great school, a great price, and usually great people. Ali was attending college with the plans of graduating with a degree in marketing. She was scheduled to graduate in the spring of 2020, much sooner than many of her friends and peers, as she'd been attending summer school on top of her regular college courses. Ali had dreams of getting a job in the fashion industry in some capacity, though she never revealed specifically what type of fashion marketing job that she'd been hoping for, at least not publicly. Ali didn't just attend the University of Mississippi, though. She wasn't just a run-of-the-mill student. She had a fierce passion that few people will ever match. Ali had helped found the Alpha Phi sorority and was even the president of the school's golf club. If this weren't enough, in her free time, she would also help teach fitness classes in the area as well. I don't know how she managed to find time to do all these things, but with summer school stacked on top of all this, it's pretty clear that Ali was a very busy person. But she always made sure to save time for friends and family. Her mother recalled Ali's dreams of attending the university and said that she didn't only have plans of carving out a great career for herself, but she also dreamed of meeting her future husband at the school. Ali felt confident that she'd be able to find a suitable partner and settle down with an honest man by the time she graduated. In the fall of 2016, Ali believed that she had finally met this man when she ran across Brandon Biesfeld, a student that she fell head over heels for. But unfortunately, these feelings were not mutual. Ali's friends say that they did their best to warn her about Brandon, but she was blinded by his presence. For whatever reason, Ali was drawn to him with a magnetic intensity. She just couldn't keep her mind off of it, but unfortunately these feelings were far from mutual, but Ali couldn't let him go. Over the course of the next few years, Ali would learn a lot about herself, after realizing how low she'd be willing to go to keep Brandon around. Oddly enough, Ali didn't actually meet Brandon Biesfeld while the two were on campus. She actually met him in Fort Worth, Texas back in 2016, but quickly learned that he was a student at the University of Mississippi. For Ali, this likely seemed like the stars were all finally aligning and their relationship was meant to be. But tragically, this simply wasn't true. Now, at the time, Ali certainly didn't know this, but everyone around her knew exactly the type of person that Brandon really was. Brandon was a part of the in crowd. He was popular from the very beginning, at least with other guys his age. As far as women, well, as soon as they actually got to know him, they'd usually go running the other way, but that wasn't true for Ali. She couldn't get enough. According to various friends and acquaintances, Brandon was, well, a terrible person. Now, I don't go around throwing insults like this very often, but I'm serious. Brandon was the very definition of a piece of human garbage. All of Ali's friends recall him as being a total tool. All he ever talked about was his father's money and how he could do whatever he wanted because his dad would always bail him out. It didn't matter if what Brandon was doing was illegal or simply immoral. He'd do whatever he wanted all the time, always, no matter who he hurt in the process. One of Ali's friends spoke about Brandon, and while this friend wished to remain anonymous, she described him as a pig. She said that he would use his family's money to do whatever he wanted, and that he'd have 6 different girls around him at one time, sitting back and laughing at them. She ended her remarks about Brandon by describing him as, quote, super misogynistic. Other friends recalled Brandon in a similar fashion. They said that he was raised as a, quote, daddy's boy, and that he had no regard for women whatsoever. He viewed them as little more than property to be played with. One friend recalled that he would constantly badger every female that he came into contact with in the dorms. He'd hang out with them, get what he wanted out of them, and then move on to the next one. Unfortunately, this seems to have been the case with Ali as well. Ali was deeply infatuated with Brandon. In the early stages of their relationship, Ali was under the impression that the two were exclusive, and that they had started dating. But according to Ali's family, she couldn't have been more wrong. Ali's mother recalled Ali coming home from college one day and announcing that she'd met a boy, specifically a boy from Texas. Her mother says that for whatever reason, Allie was always interested in Texas and the people from Texas. So when she met a boy from one of her favorite places, she couldn't have been happier. Allie initially described Brandon as nothing more than a crush, but it soon became clear that they were far more than that. Maddie Norris, one of Allie's closest friends, says that she never even met Brandon. According to Maddie, Brandon always had better things to do than meet Allie's friends and family. Maddie would later describe the relationship between Allie and Brandon as on and off again, but for Allie, Brandon was the only person she cared about. Allie's friends say that she was repeatedly crushed by Brandon. She would constantly make plans with him, then he would never show up. She'd invite friends over to meet him, but he'd disappear just hours before the meetup. She'd scheduled dates or phone calls, but he was never around. This all reached a breaking point in the summer of 2019. By this point, Allie and Brandon had been involved with one another on some level for about 3 years. But then Allie dropped a bombshell on Brandon. She sent him a text message and announced that she might be pregnant. She also sent a photo showing a pregnancy test result that came back as inconclusive. At this point, Allie was a senior in college, planning to graduate in just a few short months in the following spring. She revealed her possible pregnancy to Brandon on the 14th of June at around 10:15 p.m. While Brandon always did his best to dip and run whenever Allie reached out to him, this time was different. He responded almost immediately by saying that she should just take the Plan B pill and move on with her life. He added that he had no plans to keep a child, saying, quote, "I do not want a kid at all." Just minutes later, this was followed by another text that read, "I'm serious, no kid at all. It will ruin my life. I will not help at all." Immediately after these texts, Allie set up a time to meet with Brandon about the supposed pregnancy, but he never showed up, go figure. She scheduled multiple follow-up meetings as well, but he didn't show up to a single one of them. He would always concoct some sort of excuse and claim he was busy or had other plans or simply forgot. It wouldn't be until July of that year that Brandon would finally get around to meeting with Allie. But he didn't plan on simply meeting up with her. He had much bigger plans and a much darker secret. Allie and Brandon had once again made plans to meet up on the evening of July 19th, 2019. At this point, Allie was expected to have been about 3 months pregnant. But interestingly, police found surveillance footage from that night showing that she'd been at a bar. She got an Uber after leaving the bar and was seen driving home alone, suggesting that she'd likely been drinking. This took place at 11:52 p.m. Just a couple hours later, at 1:28 a.m., believe it or not, Brandon actually showed up for their planned meeting. He picked up Allie and the two drove down to a fishing camp at Sardis Lake. According to photos that were taken at the scene of the crime, the two had been drinking White Claws and eating. Claimed that he didn't want to report her missing so soon, but he was getting worried after he hadn't been able to find her. Just hours later, Caitlin would fail to show up for her job at David's Bridal, and this is when investigators knew something was very wrong. They collected all the information that they could from John, but considering he'd been asleep for most of the day, he really wasn't much help. Several friends and family members were also interviewed, but no one had any idea where Caitlin could have gone. But one thing was for sure, wherever she had gone, she hadn't gone willingly, because she left behind her purse, keys, and her dog. Mysteriously, her cell phone was missing, but it appears to have been turned off. Police say that volunteers began searching for Caitlin almost immediately. Her family printed out missing person flyers in record time and began handing them out all throughout the Fairfield area and other nearby towns. As far as police could tell, no one had seen Caitlin since the evening of August 13th, meaning John, her fiancé, was the last person to see her alive. After coming to this conclusion, John was called in for a polygraph test, and the results were interesting. Police got to work right away, trying to track down Caitlin, and one of the first people they brought in for questioning was John Carter, Caitlin's fiancé. After determining that John was the last person to see Caitlin alive, they certainly had a few questions to ask him. Unfortunately, John didn't have many answers. They asked John all the obvious questions. Where did you last see her? What was she wearing? Did anything seem wrong? John was seemingly answering everything honestly, but then the questions got a bit more specific. Detectives asked John if he knew anything about Caitlin's disappearance. John claimed he didn't, but the polygraph operator claimed that was a lie. When they asked if he was involved in her disappearance, he said he wasn't. That was also a lie. Police soon noticed that John also had several scratch marks on the side of his neck. When he was questioned about where these had come from, he claimed they were from a razor, but investigators didn't believe scratches like this would come from any razor. When police spoke with a friend of John's, the friend said that he didn't notice the scratches until the day after Caitlin had vanished. Over the coming weeks and months, John was asked to speak with police on at least 3 occasions, with them using a polygraph during each of these sessions. Now, while these machines aren't exactly reliable, they can certainly provide investigators with some good information. And that's definitely what they did in this case. Police say that in all 3 sessions, John was caught telling lies about where he was the night that Caitlin disappeared. While they couldn't prove it just yet, investigators knew something was up, and they were determined to prove it. But that was a lot easier said than done. That's when investigators uncovered 2 key witnesses that would help blow the case wide open. As it would turn out, 2 teenagers, who were just 15 years old at the time of the crime, had been walking by John's home on the evening of Caitlin's disappearance. The 2 teens had snuck out of their homes that night, planning to attend a party that was taking place a few miles away. As they waited outside for another friend to pick them up, they noticed 2 cars drive up to John's mother's house. One of the cars was a red Ford Focus, and the other was a dark-colored sedan with a male driver. The man in the Ford Focus pulled into the driveway, then opened the home's garage. He rummaged around inside for a few minutes before getting back into his car. It's unclear if he removed anything from the garage or if he just looked around and left. Police were later able to confirm that John had a red Ford Focus registered in his name, and they presumed he had been the driver that evening. The man in the other vehicle wasn't immediately identified. The teens say that when the men arrived, they were coming from the direction of Caitlin's house. When they left, they headed back in that same direction. Mind you, all of this took place just after 2 a.m. But according to John's statements with police, he had been in bed by this point after having been at a party. Things only got worse for John from here. When police spoke with one of Caitlin's friends in the days after her disappearance, the friend had a pretty interesting encounter with John that she was itching to share with detectives. At this point, Caitlin had been missing for just over 48 hours as far as I can tell. But the friend explained that when she spoke with John about Caitlin's disappearance, she noticed he kept speaking about her in the past tense. Now, for any investigator, this is always a massive red flag. If this isn't an obvious sign of guilt or some sort of concealed knowledge of a crime, then nothing is. To top this off, when police asked for more details about John and his relationship with Caitlin, the friend explained that John had always seemed incredibly possessive of Caitlin. While it's only natural for someone to have a healthy amount of jealousy when it comes to their partner or spouse, the friend says that John's jealousy was to the point of being aggressive. She says that Caitlin would often complain about how insecure John was, and that he would get very upset if she even talked to someone of the opposite gender. This all grew very concerning for detectives when the friend finally revealed that Caitlin had been considering breaking off their engagement. Caitlin had confided in her friend that she was incredibly unhappy with John's lifestyle, and she couldn't support his decisions anymore. He supposedly had an addiction problem and would also look at adult content online, something that Caitlin wasn't comfortable with. Worse yet, John would repeatedly pressure her into doing things in the bedroom that she just wasn't interested in, and she was tired of satisfying his strange fantasies. Now, if you recall, I mentioned that the couple had plans to move to Colorado in a few months. Well, it seems that John was the main one who was wanting to move to Colorado, and Caitlin doesn't appear to have been completely on board with this plan. John mentioned in an interview that he never wanted Caitlin to feel forced to move, which is a pretty strange choice of words if you ask me. In my own opinion, this proves that John probably knew he was being a bit pushy about things, but others may disagree. Having been an inconsiderate jerk in the past, I've gotten pretty good at spotting people like this, and John ticks all the boxes in my book. In the end, the two repeatedly delayed their plans to move, and this seems to further the idea that Caitlin simply didn't want to go. But I haven't been able to confirm whether or not this is entirely true. It's just what the evidence and witness statements seem to allude to. After several more months had passed, police had still found no leads in the search for Caitlin. They reached one dead end after another. While they certainly had enough evidence to suggest that John was involved, they didn't have enough info to prove it or even charge him with anything. But that's when things took a dramatic turn, one that no one hoped for, and certainly not one that anyone expected. It was the spring of 2013. The flowers were in full bloom, and the weather couldn't have been more perfect. But for the Markham family, perfect was far from what they had been feeling. It had been nearly 2 years since their daughter had gone missing, and they'd spent every moment they had searching for her, desperate for answers. A couple had been visiting Cedar Grove, Indiana, wandering through the woods in search of scrap metal or other valuables that may have been dropped or left behind. Little did they know that their hobby would soon lead to a massive breakthrough in the investigation for Caitlin's whereabouts. As they were scavenging through the area with their metal detectors, they came across a strange-looking rock, unlike anything they had seen before. But they soon realized this was no rock. This was a human jawbone. Police were called to the scene of the crime immediately. A team of researchers cordoned off the area and began an investigation into the remains. Before long, the discovery was tied to the disappearance of Caitlin, and investigators were forced to make the call to Caitlin's parents that every parent and family member dreads in a situation like this. In this particular case, all this did was reopen the family's wounds, as officers didn't really have any good information to share with the family. There was no silver lining because they had no leads, no proof, and virtually no evidence. When the coroner examined the bones, things only got worse. The bones had been left in the weather for so long, there was no way to tell what had happened to the victim or who had put them there. There wasn't any way to tell how Caitlin had lost her life, but there was one particular detail that was fairly strange. Now, I don't know the specifics of how the coroner determined this, but the investigator had reason to believe that Caitlin hadn't been buried in these woods for all this time. According to a more thorough examination, Caitlin had been buried for a while, then dug up, and then moved to a new location. Where this original location may have been, no one knows for sure. However, some speculate that it may have simply been an alternate location within the same patch of woods, but that's just a guess. The only thing to mention about the state of the remains is that there was evidence to suggest that Caitlin had been wounded on her wrist around the time that she lost her life. But the coroner couldn't be certain about this either. The coroner noted 3 to 4 wounds on her wrist, but it was never determined what may have caused these wounds. Though the reports that I found online suggest that they may have been caused by some sort of blade, but even that isn't known for certain. But here's the real kicker. No sooner than these remains were uncovered, the case went cold yet again. By 2015, Caitlin's father had urged the police to continue with the investigation, and the local police, after much pushback, finally agreed. They brought in new investigators to take a fresh look at the case. While they admit that they did have a suspect, they still didn't have enough evidence to pursue anyone legally. A few suspects were questioned, but everyone was set free without charges. It would be another 8 years until police would make any more progress in the case, but finally, in March of 2023, an arrest was made. By March of 2023, police announced that they had detained yet another suspect in Caitlin's disappearance. By this time, they felt confident that they could secure a conviction. I'm sure most of you expected this outcome by now, but their newfound suspect was none other than John Carter, Caitlin's fiance. See, when the coroner was examining Caitlin's remains, investigators uncovered that Caitlin was wrapped in a sheet of plastic, as well as a garden weed barrier. You know, the black fabric that you put down when setting up a flower bed to avoid weeds popping up everywhere? Well, as luck would have it, police were able to secure a search warrant for John's mother's shed. Inside the shed, they found gardening fabric that was an exact match to the fabric that had been found around Caitlin's remains. Police also found a list of other items that they believe were connected to the crime, but this list has never been made public in the hope of protecting the integrity of the investigation. During their search, police also uncovered several other key pieces of evidence and inconsistencies in John's alibi, as well as discrepancies in the stories that he told officers about the night that Caitlin had vanished. Cell phone records from both John and Caitlin show that both of their cell phones were turned off around midnight on August 13th, the evening that Caitlin vanished. John claimed he had been at a party at this time, but police felt it was a bit suspicious that both of their phones had been shut off at the exact same moment that evening. If this weren't strange enough, John claimed that he hadn't texted Caitlin at all the evening that she disappeared. However, phone records prove that this was a lie. He sent dozens of messages to her leading up to around 11:36 p.m. when the message abruptly stopped and their phones were shut off just minutes later. When police requested to look at John's phone, the texts between himself and Caitlin from that specific evening were mysteriously missing. Every other text they had shared was still there, but this specific block of text messages from that night had vanished. Police wanted to check Caitlin's phone as well, but it was never located. It was believed to have been left inside of her car on the night of her disappearance, but this was never confirmed, and all these years later, her phone has still never been found. When asked about these text messages, John initially claimed he didn't text Caitlin that evening at all. But when investigators revealed that they had phone records that proved otherwise, he said he deleted the messages by accident. Then he claimed he deleted them to make room for new texts, as he was getting flooded with texts from friends on the day that Caitlin was reported missing. This man just couldn't keep his story straight. But all of this leads up to one final revelation that took place after the search warrant was issued for John's mother's home. Inside, they found a notebook, a diary of sorts, I guess you could say, that included a few notes from John. The notebook was filled with various ramblings and unimportant writings, but one page in particular caught the attention of investigators. Researchers say that the entry appears to have been a conversation between John and what they call a demon of sorts. The note reads as follows. Deep down, I love her.
You ought to kill her.
But I love her.
She must die.
I can't kill her.
Yes, you can.
No.
Yes.
How do you talk me into all these things?
I'm just that good.
But you're bad.
I know.
How do I kill you?
You can't.
You're right.
Now what?
Nothing. This was followed by a single sentence that read, I slit your wrists with the key to your heart. I don't know about you, but that final sentence sounds like a confession if I've ever heard one, especially considering the wounds that were found on Caitlin's wrists. Needless to say, the future is not looking great for John Carter. John was arrested and held on $1 million bail. Somehow, he was able to make this payment, and he's currently a free man. His trial is set to take place next year in 2024, and investigators have every reason to believe he will be found guilty. John has never made any comments about what this note could mean. So, is he mentally ill? Does he really believe he was speaking with a demon? We just don't know at the moment. However, all of this will be answered at trial, but as it stands, the case is still technically unsolved, but don't imagine it will stay that way for long. The year is 1975. For the Foreman family, life was moving along perfectly. They had 2 wonderful kids. They were young and deeply in love, and everything was looking up. But on Mrs. Foreman's 25th birthday, tragedy would strike. As her 5-year-old son Jason was playing outside in the woods near their home, he disappeared. The family and nearby neighbors searched for the boy for hours, days, weeks, and eventually years. They found no clues or evidence that would explain his sudden disappearance. The missing boy wouldn't be found until 7 years later, when investigators met with a neighbor who made a truly disgusting confession to a crime of devastating proportions. The Foreman family had been living in South Kingstown, Rhode Island for a number of years. One of the great things about South Kingstown, and one of the things that keeps people coming back, is the beautiful beaches. The town is home to more than 10 miles of undisturbed beaches, as well as several large parks and recreation areas for small families like the Foremans. If this weren't enough, crime also isn't a particularly big deal in South Kingstown, and it never really has been. Sure, there are a few areas where things can get a bit shady, but that's true for just about every city in America. Overall, South Kingstown is just a wonderful place to be, a city rich in history and filled with things to keep young minds occupied while parents go on about their daily lives. For the Foreman family, it doesn't appear like they could have been any happier in their own little slice of heaven. The family lived in the Peacedale area on High Street. A quick look on Google Maps Street View shows that this street is still to this day just stunning. The Foremans lived on top of a hill right next to the local fire station. And from what I can tell, their home used to back up to a patch of dense woods, but it appears as though most of these wooded areas have since been cut down to make way for new housing, but I can't tell that for certain as we don't know what their specific address was. The family consisted of Joyce Foreman, John Foreman, and their 3 kids, Raven, Jason, and Jason's older brother, whose name I wasn't able to determine. The family members all got along well with one another, and there were several other kids who lived in the nearby local area, making it the perfect place to raise a growing family. Jason and his older brother would often hang out with some of these other kids, and this was the case on May 18th of 1975. May 18th was Joyce's 25th birthday. She'd been hanging out at home that day, with Jason and his brother heading out to play for the afternoon. Joyce says that she could hear the kids playing behind the home in the woods all throughout the afternoon, and she last remembers hearing the boys laughing and playing sometime around 3:30 p.m. But soon after that, things got quiet. Joyce didn't think anything of this at the time, but when Jason's brother returned home later that afternoon, Jason was nowhere to be found. His mother went out back to try to round him up, but he was gone. The family all worked together to try to find Jason and bring him home, but it was as though he vanished into thin air. His mother knew he couldn't have gotten very far, and all of the neighbors in the area soon joined in to help search for him, but still, there was no sign of him. We don't know where Jason's older brother may have been during the time that Jason disappeared, but it seems safe to assume that he likely just wandered off with the other children to play elsewhere. Jason's brother hadn't seen him since earlier that afternoon, and with no signs of him by nightfall, the family decided it was time to call in the help of the police. We don't know too much about the search efforts that were conducted for Jason officially, at least not the ones that involve the police. We know that officers took witness statements and searched for Jason far and wide, but most of the specifics of this search have been lost to time, or they were never publicly mentioned in the first place. When searching newspapers from that time period, I wasn't able to find a single mention of Jason until 1982. And that's when things began to take a pretty disturbing turn. By this point, the Foremans had been tirelessly searching for their missing son for more than 7 years. But in all this time, not a single shred of evidence was ever found by investigators. But all of that changed on April 15th. The Foremans had several neighbors who lived in close proximity to them. Their houses were all very close to one another, as is the case in many suburban neighborhoods. This meant that whatever happened at your neighbor's house, you probably knew about it. This was true when news began to spread about a disturbance involving a 14-year-old paper boy named Dale Sherman. Dale had been delivering papers one day when Michael Woodmensey noticed the boy and asked him to come inside for a bit. Michael lived directly across the street from the Foremans, but at the time it doesn't appear as though anyone witnessed Michael talking with the teen. Before their conversation was over, Michael had lured the boy into his home with the promise of giving him alcohol. Dale spoke with the New York Times in March of 2011 and recalled the day that he'd been at Michael's home, saying that Michael made good on his promise to give him alcohol, but that wasn't all he gave him. Dale recalls that soon after drinking the alcohol, he began to get incredibly tired, so much so that he could barely keep his eyes open. While all of this was going on, Michael suddenly stood up and grabbed a nearby bandana, wrapping it around Dale's neck and attempting to take his life. Somehow, in the chaos of all this, Dale managed to fight Michael off and escape his grasp. Dale hightailed it out of there and immediately ran home to tell his father. His father didn't take this report lightly, and rather than call the police, he approached Michael one-on-one. Dale's father walked over to Michael's home, knocked on the door, then promptly punched him in the face. As Dale's father was heading back home, he saw the police at a nearby residence, and he flagged them down and reported what had happened to his son. Police spoke with the two briefly, then asked that everyone come down to the police station so that they could take an official statement and try to get to the bottom of things. And this is where the case took another, much darker turn. When police were speaking with Michael, they began to suspect that he may have had a few more secrets than he was leading them to believe. Unfortunately, we don't know exactly what happened when they questioned him about his assault against Dale. But that's because they began to suspect that Michael may have been holding on to a secret much more disturbing than the one they'd actually been interrogating him about. During their conversations with Michael, at least one of the officers began to wonder if Michael may have had some information about Jason Foreman, the boy who at this point had vanished more than 7 years ago. They didn't want to ask Michael outright for fear that he might clam up and conceal the truth. So gradually, they began to steer the interrogation in a different direction, tossing in questions about Jason Foreman just here and there. But in a shocking twist, Michael actually opened up about what he knew regarding Jason Foreman's disappearance. Before long, he spilled everything he had known about the boy, and even told officers that he knew exactly what happened to Jason and where he was today. We don't know what specifically led to Michael's confession, but while being interrogated about his involvement in the crimes against Dale, Michael came clean and admitted that he had seen Jason on the day that he vanished back in May of 1975. Not only this, but he'd been in direct contact with the boy just minutes before he disappeared. The details of how all of this played out have never been revealed publicly. Even all these years later, police have kept certain aspects of the crime private in order to save the family from any more heartache. All we know for sure is that, much like in the case of Dale, Michael had spoken with Jason and managed to lure him into his house. We don't know how Michael convinced Jason to follow him home, but whatever lies he made up, the boy believed them. This is probably a good time to explain that Michael Woodmansey was just 16 years old at the time that all of this unfolded. He was still a kid himself. But Michael wasn't your typical teen by any means. Michael had seemingly been battling dark fantasies for a long time. But on May 18th of 1975, these fantasies would finally be unleashed. Once Michael had taken Jason to his home, he attacked the young boy. The only aspect of the crime that we know for certain is that at some point in the afternoon, Michael grabbed a knife from his kitchen and ambushed young Jason. Why he did this remains a mystery, but in the end, Jason lost his life. We don't know what he may have done or said to Jason before this crime took place, but we have a pretty hefty suspicion about what took place afterward. See, there's a reason why police never located the remains of Jason. Usually when a person goes missing, if they're not found alive, their remains are found a while later. But that wasn't true in Jason's case. He had simply vanished entirely, never to be seen again. But as police were speaking with Michael about the crime during his interrogation, he made a pretty bizarre statement. After confessing to the crime, he immediately got nervous and mentioned a journal or a diary or some sort of notebook that he kept in his room. Explained to officers that if they searched his home, they would find the book. But he wanted to assure them that whatever was inside this journal was purely fiction. But as far as we can tell, it wasn't. When officers found the book, their jaws hit the floor. This journal didn't just include the ramblings of a teen or a young adult. It included detailed accounts of what had happened to Jason all those years ago. Now, naturally, the exact contents of this book have never been made public. In fact, police haven't released a single word from this journal after all this time. The only reason we know what was inside is because Jason's sister spoke with officers about the journal, and they shared many of the contents with her, and she openly revealed what Michael had done to her brother all those years ago. And I promise, it's nothing you would have ever expected. Jason's sister, Raven, is now obviously an adult, and she's spoken with various news outlets in recent years about the contents of Michael's home and what investigators found during their interrogation. Raven says that while police didn't reveal anything about this journal publicly, they did share several key details with her and explain the contents of the journal, though they seem to have refused to show it to her directly. Raven spoke about the contents of the journal and explained that the journal didn't just contain a detailed account of what happened to her brother, but it had become, well, a recipe book of sorts. She says that the journal described in detail what Michael had done to Jason after claiming his life. And to keep it simple and very clear, Michael ate Jason. His motive for doing this has never been clear, but after Jason had been dealt with accordingly, Michael couldn't just ditch Jason's bones in a landfill or toss them in a creek somewhere. No, that would be too weird and twisted. So what better way to hide a body from the police than to clean each of the bones and then encase them in shellac and display them on your dresser? Now, you've probably heard the phrase, "the truth is stranger than fiction." Well, that's certainly true here. While Michael insisted that the contents of this journal were fiction, Raven says that the police have an overwhelming amount of evidence that proves that the accounts written inside this journal were entirely real. Now, some reports claim that Jason's bones were displayed on Michael's dresser as if they were trophies, though other reports claim that the bones had been shellacked and kept inside of a box. I don't know which of these reports is more accurate, but needless to say, investigators had all the evidence they needed to secure a conviction. But this is where the case takes yet another turn, and again, it's not a good one. See, when investigators were pursuing the case, they were running all of the details by the Foreman family. While officers wanted to secure a conviction of first-degree murder, they were concerned about the impact that the trial would have on the Foreman family. Needless to say, the Foreman family had already been to hell and back, and to make them sit through a trial and hear each of the gruesome details of their son's final moments may have just pushed them over the edge. To get past this, police offered Jason's father a way to sidestep this process. Rather than pursue a conviction of first-degree murder, they would pursue second-degree murder. This would still secure Michael Woodmansee a 40-year conviction, but it would keep the family from having to hear all of the details inside the journal, and also keep them from having to see their son's remains on display when they were used as evidence in the trial. Jason's father agreed to this plea deal, and Michael was sent to prison for 40 years instead of getting a life sentence. But once again, the case takes yet another turn, and this may be the darkest twist yet. The backlash from this case was serious. The entire community of South Kingstown was enraged by what Michael had done. And to say that he had a target on his back would be an understatement. When Michael was sent to prison, he had to be sent to an out-of-state facility in Massachusetts for his own protection. But considering he was prosecuted under Rhode Island law, that meant that all of Rhode Island's rules and regulations regarding prisoners were still applicable in Michael's